Hi everyone, welcome back to season 5 of the How to Do It video series. Now we're positioned here today at Nutrition Farms in Applethorpe, and we've got behind us some of our Red Delicious. We're one of the few growers still growing Red Delicious, and we found a little niche. We didn't pull them out like everyone else did, and of course they're the highest antioxidant level of any apples. What we're going to talk about in this segment is a really, really important concept that many people have heard the word float past them, but perhaps never understood the concept. And it's really the essence of nutrition farming. It's the essence of life, as I'll explain. We're going to talk about something called Redox, which means reduction and oxidation and their balance. And we'll talk about redox reactions and what they mean to us and how we can understand a whole bunch of things we wouldn't have perhaps otherwise understood in light of understanding redox and how it works. So the starting point, and you've heard me say it many times, the most important element for growing a crop is not N, it's not P, it's not K, it's not calcium. The most important single element is oxygen. We last 2 minutes without it. Unless you're a pearl diver, you might last 10 minutes. It's the single most important. It drives everything for microbes, for plants, for animals, for human beings. Single most important substance for life is oxygen, and it relates directly to this concept, as I'll explain in a moment, this concept of redox. This thing's going to help you understand why some soils, you look at your soil test, you say, I've got everything right here, and it's not working. And you're putting on more and more fertiliser with less and less response. And it sort of explains this understanding, can explain that phenomenon. And it's a really, really common occurrence, that inexplicable lack of performance regardless of fertiliser. So what we're doing here is getting back to root causes. And we're looking at not more fert, but how we can fix soil function. And the kind of red flags for this poor redox scenario, as I said, poor fert response, patchy crops, leaf tests. This is a big one. We're going to talk about this in more depth. Leaf tests that don't make sense. You've got a soil test, you can see what's there, and the leaf test doesn't match that at all, or some major differences. And of course, that inexplicable lack of productivity. So the missing link, of course, in this scenario is this concept of how the soil's functioning. And the starting point is structure. And of course, that structure then determines, remember, the atmosphere is filled with oxygen gas, and it diffuses. Gas moves from a high concentration to a low concentration. If you've got an open, friable structure, in pours the all-important oxygen, and the biology says yes, and nutrient cycling happens, and you're driven by biology. It's just understanding. It's got this major paradigm shift. It's not something you stand the plant up and chuck some fert and chemicals at. It's a living, breathing system. It's not just a warehouse to store a few minerals. And that's, as I said, a bit of a paradigm shift for some people. So let's look at redox. What is it exactly? Well, basically, this is the electrical life of soils, of plants, of microbes, of animals, of humans. And it involves the movement of electrons. Now, what are electrons? Well, they're basically the energy and information sources and carriers. And all life depends upon electron flow. Oxygen, the great electron donor, is the driver of this thing. Soils have to breathe. So we've talked about the two key things that can help determine that. The big ratio, the calcium to magnesium ratio, the great beach ball, large ion called calcium with two positive charges holding a piece of negatively charged clay on either side and pushing apart that clay. It's called flocculation, opening up that soil. And magnesium, a little golf ball compared to the beach ball, also with two charges, pulling the clay in tighter rather than opening it and giving you that tight, closed, heavy soil. But in a sandy soil where the soil's almost breathing too well, or not almost, it is over-oxygenating, we actually want to create some structure in some instances, and so we actually want a little more magnesium in those light sandy soils, like these soils here, where we put magnesium out most years. Really important because it will give some structure to a soil that doesn't have any, basically, because it will tighten up and create a little bit of structure in sandy soils. So the biggest deal, so Cal-Mag ratio we talked about, single most important thing, get that somewhere around where it needs to be. It doesn't have to be perfect, but if you've got a 1-to-1 Cal-Mag ratio and you need a 7-to-1 in a clay soil, you've got a soil that's not breathing, and you've got all sorts of redox issues that we'll talk about in a moment. So number 3 is waterlogging, and huge. We've all, here at the moment, we just had a bit of a sort of mini drought. We had 50 mils, thank God, just a few days ago, and the trees turned around quite quickly. They were struggling. But waterlogging, prior to that, 4 years of really, really wet seasons, and wet winters are quite an issue because spring tells you the story of what's happened in that restriction of oxygen and so forth during that waterlogging period. So redox collapses without oxygen, nutrients lost, or they become toxic, and we'll talk about how they work. And of course, when oxygen's low, microbes say, okay, I've got to have some oxygen, so they take it from NO3, they take it from nitrate nitrogen, and when they take one oxygen to to be able to do their thing, that becomes NO2, and off it goes as gas. If they take all 3, it becomes nitrous oxide, nitrous dioxide with the 2, or nitrous oxide, and up it goes. And so you lose your nitrogen. Really common side effect of that scenario. The second side effect of waterlogged soils is what happens to iron and manganese, and we'll talk about that shortly. But first of all, we'll talk about what is redox. Well, what does it mean? The word means reduction and oxidation, and they're balanced. So what's reduction? Reduction is, weirdly, it's kind of backwards, because reduction is a gain of electrons, and oxidation, remember redox, reduction, oxidation. Oxidation is the loss of electrons. So reduction is gain of electrons, the opposite of what you'd think, and oxidation is a loss of electrons. And here it gets a little even more confusing, because when iron, normally in the soil, is in the form called Fe3, and when it moves to an unstable Fe2, it gains an electron. And so that's called a reduction example. So iron moving from Fe3 to Fe2 is called reduction, even though it's gained an electron. So it's kind of a bit confusing. So the biggest of all the electron acceptors is oxygen. And in its absence, microbes often will turn to what's sort of like the battery, the most abundant trace mineral in the soil, and that trace mineral is iron. And so when they turn to iron, which is there usually as Fe3, iron accepts electrons and it becomes Fe2, and that makes it super available, and it makes it 2 available. And what you'll see is iron toxicity, and quite closely behind it will be manganese. So the thing that you'll see in a soil that's not breathing and that's not working is leaf tests with high iron and high manganese that don't reflect high iron and manganese in the soil. And that's what's happening in this situation. Fe3 has become Fe2, much more available, and floods the plant, and the same thing happens with manganese. So iron and manganese become toxic in tight, closed, or waterlogged, or compacted soils, because compactions are very much the same story in terms of reducing oxygen. So the leaf tests, the red flags when you've got redox issues: high manganese, probably number 1, but certainly is right there. Low calcium. Now, here's a big story, because calcium is so important. Calcium is a trucker of 7 other minerals. Calcium determines the breathing of the soil, the quality, cell division, so many things. This hugely important mineral. And you've got calcium levels, you might have your 68% calcium in the soil, but it's not coming through in the leaf. And that's absurdly common. It's not slightly common. It's almost every leaf test. But in this scenario where it's actually not just not getting through well, it's actually low calcium, you've got to have breathing soils. You've got to have root respiration to deliver calcium. And herein comes the other part of that story. So calcium, and that low calcium that shows up on leaf tests, it's huge, we said. It's the super immobile key mineral, as we talked about, that determines the breathing of the soil, that determines cell division, that carries 7 other minerals into the plant. Determines cell strength. It's such an important mineral, it's ridiculous. And you don't want low calcium. And why is it low? Because roots need to be respiring to uptake calcium. And there's a huge link here when they say your fungi is directly linked to calcium uptake. Part of that link is the fungi, with their hyphae, grab some clay and humus, and they create the larger aggregates in the soil. They create the breathing capacity, the two things that determine good redox and good oxygen, or what we call gas exchange, oxygen in, flowing in, diffusing in, and the roots and the organisms using it, and now there's a lot of CO2 in the root zone and it diffuses out. Plant leaves waiting with little mouths called stomates to suck up that CO2, combine it with water and sunlight, and that's how you grow stuff. And the better you do that, the better you do. So what determines that, and of course it's directly linked to this thing called redox, is how well the soil breathes, Cal-Mag ratio, and fungi-to-bacteria ratio. And while that used to be guesswork, it need never be with a simple little tool called a microbiometer. So you can test your soil, you're aiming for a 1-to-1 fungi-to-bacteria ratio, and what you'll find in the vast majority of soils is 80-90% bacteria and 10-20% fungi, because we knocked them out with fungicides and herbicides and some of our tillage practices and so forth. So huge gains in bringing back your fungi. Check your fungi to bacteria ratio with a microbiometer and find out where you're at, and then you can set up a game plan. So high manganese in the leaf, low calcium, high iron. We talked about how that works. F3 becomes F2, and then it's super available and floods the plant, causes toxicity, shuts down a couple of other minerals as well. Low nitrogen, despite your fertilizers. And sometimes you see this high K relative to magnesium thing that comes through sometimes on a leaf test. So as we said, this calcium mineral is huge, and we do need to address it. Minerals as electron managers, we talked about how basically iron is like the battery, and it's the first go-to when there's a shortage of oxygen, and that, of course, creates the iron in the toxic form. Magnesium tends to stabilize. Silica is kind of a stress buffer. Interesting with iron, when we just talk about it, I mean, one of our growers one of our consultants has a turf business, and he just sells so much, and I was wondering why, of just basically iron fulvic acid with iron sulfate, huge amounts of it. And then we tried it, and honestly, if you've got redox issues, it's only really a Band-Aid, but if you've got redox issues and you've got problems with iron just gives a greening response. It's a wonderful thing on pastures. Just iron sulfate is a really quick kick to get some growth and some green, if that's what you need. So the biology story, we just continue with redox. The biology story, root speed microbes unlock nutrients, and basically redox becomes better balanced. It's the sort of performance chain. It's structure, it's oxygen, it's redox reactions, it's biology, it's nutrition, it's yield. It's a chain. So basically fixing redox in order, number one, when you're trying to fix this thing, if that's the cause, is drainage. It's the first thing you're going to do. It can be absolutely immeasurably invaluable if you've got waterlogging to get in and do some drainage. So even deep ripping, but drainage is much better, of course, much more structured. So drainage, number one, structure and how you can change soil structure. And of course, we've talked about calcium if you need it, and we'll talk shortly about gypsum and so forth. Biology, that can improve it. There are certain supplements, and of course the Humates are the big one that can change soil structure, and the whole concept of mineral balance. So basically what we're often trying to do is fix a broken engine by adding more fuel, and we're trying to get back to root causes, as we said. So, and the results of that misguided approach is just chucking more and more on. The results of fixing that, you've got reduced inputs, you've got better consistency, you've got more resilience. It's a lovely little win-win story. So let's talk about some of the solutions to a poor redox reaction scenario. Now, we've talked about drainage. We've talked about the calcium to magnesium ratio and the flocculation that comes with that, the opening, the pushing apart of the clay. We've talked about using magnesium in over-oxidized soils, because there's also the other side of the equation where you can have too much oxygen, and that causes problems we'll talk about in a moment. And we can use magnesium in those soils to actually try and tighten them up a little bit. But probably the big one, and often it's relevant because you've got enough calcium, you don't want too much more calcium. The big one is the simple substance called gypsum. Now, gypsum, of course, is calcium sulfate. And what gypsum does in terms of soil tightening scenarios, and the two things that have most impact on soils in terms of creating a soil that doesn't breathe, are magnesium and sodium. Well, gypsum breaks apart. Calcium sulfate breaks apart in the soil. That's why they call it the clay breaker. It breaks apart and it grabs hold of magnesium and it forms magnesium sulfate, or it grabs sodium and forms sodium sulfate. And they are very leachable forms of those two minerals. and those minerals leach when the next rain comes. And that's why gypsum can break up a clay and open up a soil. Now, what we've had great results with is the concept of taking gypsum, micronizing it down to 5 microns, which is really, really tiny. It's super plant available. And basically that tiny size and that huge surface area means all the things that gypsum can do happens more rapidly, but more importantly, you can deliver that liquid micronized gypsum via fertigation or through liquid injection of planting right into that root zone. So you're talking about this tiny area. You might not be able to afford to do the amount of gypsum that's required to do the whole paddock. You've got a delivery mechanism now to get that effect in that rhizosphere, this tiny area where all the breathing and all the action happens. And so the liquid gypsums have become hugely popular globally, or our liquid gypsum has, and I suppose there's others out there as well, because they provide that root zone management, which can be of such value. Basalt, we'll talk about it when we get out to Claudia's farm a little later today, basalt and the benefits of basalt, but it's actually a really good tool. It's inexpensive. It's not particularly soluble and it doesn't kick in the mineral quantity rapidly, but there is a trick to that as well we'll talk about. But it's considered to be a redox buffer. It can accept and donate electrons, so it slows those rapid redox swings that we don't want to see, and it boosts the electron exchange capacity. So we talk about CEC, there's also a thing called EEC, electron exchange capacity, and one of the tools for improving that is basalt. Another is humic acid, and gypsum, because it opens the soil, it improves the electron exchange capacity as well. There's also a thing with crusher dust we'll talk about later called enhanced weathering, which also has an impact. So what happens in soils that aren't struggling to breathe, soils that, this is one of them, a light sandy soil, what happens in that instance when it's over-oxidized? It's a real problem because it's so hard in these soils to build organic matter, because organic matter burns very, very quickly. It oxidizes very quickly when too much oxygen is coming. It's just like if you till, you lose organic matter. If you till wet, you quadruple that loss. So sands, oxygen's pouring into those sands, and there's actually in many instances a little bit too much in the equation. So organic matter burns, really hard to build organic matter in those soils, and we'll talk about action plans. Basically, your action plan in a sand is to try and slow oxygen down, try and protect your carbon, and there's a huge role here for humates that we'll talk about shortly, trying to rebuild some aggregation and bring some fungi into that equation, bring a little bit more magnesium into the equation, try and restore your trace cycling, because often your trace is shut down in sand. You'll see that on leaf tests, and it's all linked to this redox function. So what kind of tools can you use in a sandy soil? Compost extracts. We showed you in a recent video how to effectively make a compost extract, but they're wonderful in that instance. Microbe foods, humic, kelp feeds fungi, humic feeds fungi. Humic, wonderful in sand. I couldn't grow here without humic acid used regularly to hold on to things and to change soil structure and so forth. And of course, foliars to boost root exudates and feed that biology to get things happening. So foliars on sand can be very effective, as they are here. And basalt for that longer term buffer. So basically, as we said, redox kind of explains why soils are not working when you think they would be. It shows you how wet winters can hurt spring. And it also shows you why fertiliser sometimes disappoints. Now, we'll just conclude this segment. We're talking about humates, because I've talked about them many times and their value, but they're probably immensely important, their most important role almost, and no one talks about it. But the most important role of humates is relative to this concept of redox. They're hugely important because they accept and they donate electrons. They shuffle them around, fulvic particularly, and they're a really powerful redox buffer. So you don't have spikes and drops, which can be a real problem for production. They counter toxicity, and I'll explain how that works. This is iron and manganese toxicity in tight, closed soils. So humates can counter that, and they slow oxidation in sand, particularly humic. So how are they doing this deal with the slowing, the collating and complexing the super available form of iron and manganese, the toxic forms of iron and manganese, and basically have this effect of reducing that toxicity. So they're hugely important in that poor redox soils, and one of the greatest tools to fix it. Fulvic, of course, much smaller, 10 times smaller than humic, Does what it does quicker, but leaches, whereas humic doesn't leach, so it stays there in the sand, and we use it all the time in this orchard. Wonderful thing in sand. It's one of the most important tools. But fulvic to collate, to drive bacterial response, because it's a bacterial food, and it's a whole stimulant and plant growth promotant in its own right. But fulvic acid, humic acid, in our case, rapidly become our fastest selling humate in 50 countries, a product called Fulvex, which is half humic, completely 100% soluble powder, half humic and half fulvic acid. And basically what's interesting and what's different about Fulvex is that you can put it with anything. Now, that's not the case usually with humic, because humic's extracted with an alkaline extraction. It's called potassium hydroxide. It's very alkaline, and it falls out of solution and turns into Vegemite. Some of you might be wondering what that is. It's a popular breakfast spread in Australia. It turns into Vegemite in the bottom of your tank, and you do not have a smile on your face at that point. That's always been the problem with humic. It's wonderful. It magnifies everything. It collates things, but it's not compatible with many things. Sodium borate and urea just about wrap it up. Now we've got a humic and a fulvic together that are compatible with everything. So just in terms of quantifying that it goes with everything, it goes with everything if you dissolve the Fulvex first. There's an issue we've found with just a couple of things, particularly calcium nitrate. If you put the calcium nitrate, it's the order in which they're added. If the Fulvex is dissolved beforehand, there's no problem. If you put the calcium nitrate and dissolve it and then put the Fulvex in, there is an issue. There can be some little clumping and some issues develop with it. So that's just a little user-friendly aspect of it that you need to know about. But anyway, that pretty much wraps up our very important story about this thing called Redox. If you've got a scenario, as I mentioned, where you're getting poor fertiliser response, you've got patchy crops, you've got leaf tests that don't make sense, you've got this kind of inexplicable lack of productivity, look at this all-important thing called redox reactions. Look at how well your soil's breathing. Is it over-breathing? Is it under-breathing? And do something about it. Thanks for listening.